This week on Inside Scoop, the media torches its credibility over Joe Biden, the Trump administration's big tech fight with the European Union, and Hamas's little helpers at the UN. Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host. And this week our cover story concerns how the media lit its credibility on fire over the health and age-related decline of former President Joe Biden. We have recently seen a new spate of books that give a lot of additional details about how the Biden White House functioned or didn't function.
They filmed an entire town hall and they determined that it was not usable. Now, some people say this was because Joe Biden was incoherent. He could not really articulate his thoughts in a pithy or even semi-normal way. Some people just said the lighting was bad.
Around the fact that an octogenarian president had a lot of limitations, and these limitations appeared to increase the longer he was in office.
Indian River community, the healing, nothing wrong with me.
But you'll note that a lot of this reporting did not happen until after Biden left office and after the 2024 election was already over.
We resolve our differences at the battle box. That's how we do it, at the battle box.
So what went wrong? You saw a lot of media outlets that were not especially accepting of storylines that questioned whether Biden was perhaps too old to continue in his role as president.
Can I go up this way?
And a number of media outlets that were covering these stories sort of connected to the White House, really deferential to the White House line, calling a lot of the video footage of Biden seeming feeble to be cheap fakes or deceptively or maliciously edited.
And if you run that tape a little bit longer, you would see what was happening, what the president was actually doing, and it is a cheap fake.
So that is what about nothing, and he's totally normal.
What I'm saying is, this is a president, right? Let's step back for a second. Instead of, and I said this moments ago, instead of Republicans, focusing on the president's performance in office and what he's been able to accomplish, his actual record, they do these cheap fakes. They're cheap fakes. And you're asking me about the Maloney, you're asking me what happened. That video was, okay, let's talk about Juneteenth. The president stood there listening to the music and he didn't dance. Excuse me, I did not know not dancing was a health issue. That is a weird thing to actually flag.
And really as late as in the days before the fateful presidential debate in June of 2024, we're casting doubt on the idea that there was anything wrong with President Biden at all.
I've been all over the world with you. I've been in and out of battles anyway.
Then things took a swift turn when we had that June 27th debate, and no one could any longer deny what their eyes and ears were already telling them, that Biden was at a minimum a severely diminished communicator, which would be a major obstacle to waging a competitive re-election campaign.
On the total initiative relative to what we can do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. Look.
And much as the Democrats did themselves, the media then turned very sharply against Biden.
Well, let me say this as clearly as I can. I'm staying in the race. I'll beat Donald Trump. I will beat him again in 2020.
Only to resume a more cheerleading role once Biden finally did drop out and was replaced at the top of the Democratic ticket by his vice president, Kamala Harris.
And he showed once again what true leadership looks like.
The result of all of this and this sort of optics of the media seeming to only become hostile in its Biden coverage once he was a liability to the Democratic Party is one of the reasons why a lot of these books and a lot of the new reporting about the Biden White House isn't really assuaging people's concerns about the media.
Ever have a moment with him where you thought maybe he was unfit to run for president? No.
And we'd had several long talks. I had never seen him and walked away thinking he can't do this anymore. He was always on top of his brief.
End of quote. Repeat the line.
People seem to think that a lot of it is too little too late and are not convinced that the media has learned any of its lessons of what went wrong in terms of its Biden coverage. These questions are going to be really important going forward because the media is going to want to be very critical in its coverage of the current president, Donald Trump. How can they be taken seriously and be seen as nonpartisan when they do the tough coverage and they ask those demanding questions of Trump when Biden, for the most part, seemed to get a free pass until it was really too late? What do you think? Please comment down below. And this week I'm joined by Taylor Millard, who's written a piece for the magazine in this issue on an intersection of big tech, the European Union, and possibly even some divisions within the Trump administration itself. Thank you for joining us today, Taylor.
Thanks for letting me be here.
So Taylor, why don't you walk us through a little bit about this sort of complicated nexus that you've written about here?
It really, describing it as a complicated nexus is really the best way to look at it. What we have is the Trump administration is at war figuratively, of course, with the European Union regarding this domestic markets, or this Digital Markets Act, which is the EU's big tech regulations. It labeled 5 to 6 companies as gatekeepers, meaning they're the ones who have the biggest market share. And of course, what ended up happening was they had Apple, Google, Meta, Twitter, and then TikTok on their list of gatekeepers. Well, 4 of those 5 are American companies, so it was really looked at this big issue regarding American big tech, and what the DMA does is it was supposed to put limits on those companies so that then what could happen is it would promote European production, technological production, things like that. The Trump administration was not a fan of the DMA because, and Vice President J.D. Vance talked about this in his speech in France earlier this year, where he said that this is the type of thing that really stifles innovation and really prevents America and the EU from beating China when it comes to the artificial intelligence race. At the same time, even though there is this public-facing discussion and this public-facing complaints about the DMA from the Trump administration, Trump has criticized it too, then you go and you look at what's going on inside the Trump administration. And while you have people who are publicly against the DMA, privately, and there are public memos about this that were put out, they still have this war on big tech in the U.S., even as big tech has sidled up to the Trump administration. FTC Chair Christopher Ferguson discussed how much he really wanted to see discussions regarding keeping the head of keeping big tech from becoming far too big and doing the conservative censorship on social media and talking about the importance of making sure that free speech is a big thing. So that's the complicated discussion that's going on within the Trump administration, with the FTC, with the U.S. trade representative, Jameson Greer, who has made some very public remarks about how the DMA is this bad idea and won't help anything. And that's what the Trump administration is facing right now, and kind of the conflicting messages that are being sent out to the EU and really to everybody else.
Well, it's interesting as you mention this, because you could imagine in an American context the Trump administration liking sort of a U.S. only DMA, or at least something like that, because it does fit in with their basic critique of big tech. But they also don't like the European Union penalizing American companies, and they're trying to expand market access, and they're also doing some protectionist policies here at home. Sort of a complicated, it shows how complicated some of these issues and these different motivations can sort of become.
Yeah, especially when you look at what the FTC chair has said. He made a comment about how he is not in favor of the DMA, but then at the same time he said he would rather there be an American version of it, and America tackle the problem, quote unquote, of big tech. And when something gets too big, they want to crack down on it. You know, when you look at the antitrust case that is still going on against Google, the Trump administration, Trump 2.0, is continuing what Trump 1.0 and the Biden administration continued to do. You look at senators like Josh Hawley in Missouri, who is very anti-big tech and is very, I mean, he made a comment about how corporations have basically become the government and taken over the governmental power unless the government takes that back. So it's really complicated and really weird to see it happen with Republicans, because in the past they had been very light touch regulation and very, hey, let's let companies do what they need to do.
What have American free market advocates what have they had to say about this fight?
Well, they've actually used the words of J.D. Vance and kind of said, hey, Vance is correct on this. I talked to multiple people, whether it was Jennifer Huddleston from Cato Institute or Josh Withrow from the R Street Institute, who both said that if you put these restrictions on big tech, and if you break up big tech and slow them down and cause problems, that stifles innovation, and that prevents companies from advancing. You know, you look at the way that Facebook and the way that Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it this week, the reason why they got so big is because they were innovative. They were successful. You look at things that were done, I mean, like 20 years ago, the main places that people were going to search for stuff was either AOL or Yahoo News or Yahoo or Alta Vista. None of those exist anymore, really. And if they do, they're just lower.
Legacy.
Yeah, they're legacy. They're not that big. And that's the big thing, is that these companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, would not have become the innovators that they were if there wasn't light touch regulations that were out there. And so that's what the free market advocates have been saying, and have been saying that, hey, if you put further governors on this type of thing, you're going to see the U.S. lose this race with China when it comes to AI.
Thank you, Taylor. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can click here to read Taylor's article in our digital magazine. This week, I'm joined by Washington Examiner magazine columnist Dominic Green. Dominic, for this week's issue, has written an article looking at how the United Nations is still helping Hamas and the tensions between the Trump administration, the United Nations, and the Israeli government over aid to Gaza. Welcome, Dom.
Hello, Jim.
So, Dom, I think a lot of people would think that it's jarring to hear that the United Nations is helping Hamas, or maybe given the character of the UN, people might not find it this jarring. But walk us through a little bit about the dynamic that you describe in this week's article.
Well, I find it jarring, and I think a lot of people do. And this is a story which has cooked along for many, many years, and which, after the Hamas attacks on Israel on October the 7th, 2023, couldn't be ignored anymore and has become a matter of international interest. On October the 7th, there's a lot of evidence to show that UN employees were among those who had planned and perpetrated this unprecedented horror and were involved in the kidnapping and the management of the kidnapped Israeli hostages. And there are some 13 UN agencies operating in Gaza, and we still don't know the full extent of how they've been operating over a number of years. Particular attention has focused on two agencies, UNRWA, the Reliefs and Works Administration, and more recently, UNICEF. UNRWA is a deeply compromised organization which claimed not to know that Hamas had literally hardwired itself into UNRWA's premises. They literally tapped the electricity from UNRWA headquarters and dug one of their operations rooms into its basement. The particular element of the story that I talk about is to do with food supply. This has been a very controversial issue in recent months, allegations of a humanitarian crisis, which the Israelis deny. And they say Hamas is stealing the food, stockpiling it, and effectively funding its war by selling it onto the Palestinian people in Gaza. And when we are looking at now, what you're seeing is American contractors handing out aid with Israeli soldiers guarding them at 2, and eventually it should be 4 locations in the Gaza Strip. And we've seen occasional scenes of chaos, but also successes in terms of the distribution. Now, one of the mechanisms that's used, UNICEF sends money to a list of pre-approved Palestinians in Gaza, and this list is prepared by the Hamas-run Ministry of Social Development, which is run by a man called Ghazi Hamad, who is on the U.S. Treasury's list of terrorists. He's a proscribed actor. And yet somehow this man has ended up effectively operating in partnership with the United Nations charity. And as documents that NGO Monitor published last week, the British government is more than happy to send money to UNICEF earmarked for the Palestinians in Gaza. And this British government paper showed they were aware that they would effectively be working hand in glove with Hamas in order to do this. And the paper describes reputational damage being a risk, but they went ahead and they did it. And the result is a severe reputational damage. And one of the questions that has arisen really from the very beginning of this war that is still ongoing is, well, if the UN isn't going to do it, who will? And that brings us really to the next question of, can the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is American-Israeli project, replace the operations of the UN in Gaza?
So as you say, Dom, the United States and Israel would like to replace the United Nations role in aid to Gaza. How is that currently going?
Well, the optimist would say that simply recognizing that the United Nations can no longer be trusted is a huge step towards fixing it. The pessimist would point out that this is the Middle East when there is no necessity that anything ever gets fixed or improved. I would say it's very much a mixed bag. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was set up by an ex-Marine called Jake Woods. It's not clear where all the money to fund this substantial amount of aid has come from. He resigned after the New York Times pointed to the organizational background, basically having come from a U.S. security contractor working with Israeli freelancers. The Benjamin Netanyahu was kept purposefully vague about the post-war plans for Gaza, in part to maintain good relations with his Western allies. And so the question of what to do on the day after was effectively passed off to anyone who was interested in it. And they found this American company, Safe Reach Solutions, who then came up with the plan. Now, this is very ad hoc. It's thrown together, and there's a war still going on. The shift to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation operating in Gaza has happened almost simultaneously, while at the other end of the Gaza Strip, the Israelis have stepped up their military actions there. So this is an inherently chaotic situation following on from more than 18 months of inherently destructive warfare, which may well go on for a while. So to expect a rapid transition is I think, unreasonable. To stabilize the position of the civilians in Gaza itself is an achievement. one other question, which I think the US and Israel are sort of on the same page and yet not wholly on, is this question of the political framework. Because whoever controls the aid and whoever controls the charity that goes into Gaza has a crucial influence over the internal politics of Gaza. And at the moment, of course, the internal politics are managed by, whoever has succeeded the last, Hamas leader to have been blown up. So it's, again, a very chaotic system. But the crucial thing is the food and aid will be essential to reconstructing any kind of outcome, whether it's a return to the October the 6th, 2023, whether it's a completely different paradigm of that the Trump administration has talked about, or the Israelis would like to see, or even the Gulf donors would like to see. All of these things depend on creating a new and accountable structure for aid and food delivery. And on this, what's striking to me is that the United States' European allies are very much on the same side in this as the United Nations and Hamas, in fact, because the UN and Hamas have both said that nobody else should be distributing the food. And it is shocking, as you're saying, that all the way through this war, the United States' Western European allies, France and Germany, Britain particularly, have been knowingly contributing funds that inevitably will have gone to support Hamas's war.
So it may be a fool's errand to predict what's going to happen in the Middle East, but where do you see things going next?
Well, I suspect they'll go downhill slowly, which would be a success compared to going downhill quickly. But there will come a point, because there always does, when things will either bottom out or there'll be one of those uneasy truce periods. In the last round of negotiations, which Steve Witkoff was furious about when he thought he had Hamas's agreement, the Israelis had agreed, and Hamas suddenly changed their terms for the latest ceasefire from 60 days to 7 years with various, extra asks. At some point, some kind of political stabilization will occur. The Israelis are adamant that it won't involve Hamas, and it may well not. And again, the framework in which the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is operating also includes, and here it's very difficult to get details, groups operating in Gaza who are not Hamas and seem to be willing to strike a deal with Israel or with the Gulf Arabs or the US, and in other words, alternative patrons to go with alternative food. You can see how these things would add up to some kind of governance. But how long it takes is a very good question, and I couldn't guess, to be honest. I think the Israelis have committed themselves to a necessary but open-ended conflict, and I wouldn't say it necessarily will end soon.
Thank you, Dominic. And you can read Dominic's article and all the stories we've discussed today in the Washington Examiner magazine. This has been your Inside Scoop. I'm Jim Antle. We'll catch you next time.